The Disappearance of Mr. Harold, a scary story from Reddit. Subscribe to Scary Stories Vault for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. I've always believed that people who choose to live in small, quiet neighborhoods like mine are either looking for peace or hiding from something. The rows of nearly identical houses, each with perfectly manicured lawns, always gave off an air of predictability and routine. Everyone knew everyone else's business, at least on the surface. That's why when Mr. Harold moved into the old, dilapidated house at the end of the street, people were quick to notice that something was off about him. At first, there wasn't much to go on. He seemed like any other middle-aged man, tall, thin, a bit haggard, maybe from a rough patch in his life. He rarely spoke, kept mostly to himself, and avoided eye contact with neighbors. Most of us wrote him off as a recluse, someone who valued privacy over idle neighborhood chit-chat. But as time passed, small, strange details about Mr. Harold began to surface. It was little things at first, odd behavior that most would dismiss. For instance, Mr. Harold would often be seen pacing back and forth on his porch at night, even in the rain. He'd mutter under his breath, sometimes stopping abruptly to stare out into the street. His house was always dark, save for one single window on the second floor that stayed lit well past midnight. The neighborhood kids were the first to spread rumors, as kids do. They said Mr. Harold was a ghost or a criminal on the run. They claimed to have seen him digging in his backyard late at night, though I dismissed it as childish imagination. But as I started to observe him more closely, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The real turning point, though, came about 6 months after he moved in. It was late October, the air crisp with the onset of fall, and the streets were lined with jack-o'-lanterns and decorations for Halloween. That evening, I was walking my dog down the street when I noticed something strange. Mr. Harold's front door was wide open, and he was standing just inside the doorway, staring out into the darkness. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, seemed to pierce right through me as I passed. I gave him a nod, out of courtesy more than anything, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless. For the rest of my walk, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there like a statue. When I returned home, I told my wife about it. She shrugged it off, saying that Mr. Harold was probably just lonely and that I was reading too much into it. But the following morning, things took an even stranger turn. I woke up early, as I always do, to get the paper from the driveway. As I bent down to grab it, I noticed something odd on Mr. Harold's front lawn. From a distance, it looked like some sort of debris, maybe garbage that had blown in during the night. But as I walked closer, I realized it wasn't debris at all. It was a trail of dirt, leading from his front door all the way to the street. The trail was about 2 feet wide, uneven, as if someone had dragged something heavy across the yard. I looked up at Mr. Harold's house, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. But the door was shut, the windows dark. The house, for once, seemed completely still. I debated going over to knock on the door, but something held me back, something that felt like fear. For the next few days, Mr. Harold seemed to disappear entirely. No more late-night pacing on the porch. No more dim light in the upstairs window. The dirt trail had dried up, but the eerie silence around his house remained. I asked a few of my neighbors if they had seen him lately, but no one had. One of them, Mrs. Phillips, mentioned that his mail had been piling up, and she hadn't seen him take out the trash in over a week. That's when we started to worry. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut anymore. There was something wrong with Mr. Harold. He wasn't just a strange, reclusive man. Something had happened to him. Against my wife's protests, I decided to call the police for a welfare check. I told them about the trail of dirt, the strange behavior, and how no one had seen him in days. They assured me they'd send someone out to take a look. When the police arrived later that day, I watched from my window as they knocked on Mr. Harold's door. No answer. They circled around the house, peering into the windows, but didn't seem alarmed. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers walked back to his car and radioed something in. A few minutes later, the other officer returned from around the back, shaking his head. They left shortly after, and for the next few days, there was no word about what they had found, no news, no updates. The house remained silent. It wasn't until the following week that I saw the moving van. It was early in the morning, and I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when I saw it parked in front of Mr. Harold's house. 2 men were loading boxes into the back, their expressions unreadable. There was no sign of Mr. Harold. I watched for a while, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. After a few hours, the van drove off and the house stood empty. Mr. Harold was gone, just like that. No goodbyes, no explanation. Over the next few months, the neighborhood returned to its usual routine, but I couldn't let go of the mystery surrounding Mr. Harold's disappearance. Where had he gone? Why had the police been so unfazed? And what was that dirt trail in his yard? Despite Mr. Harold's sudden departure, I couldn't let the whole thing go. There was something unnerving about how it all unfolded. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose, none of which I could answer. The police had seemed disinterested, and the moving van that took away his things only deepened the mystery. I felt unsettled, and part of me regretted not knocking on his door that last night. I saw him. A few months passed, and winter settled in. Snow blanketed the street, hiding all the remnants of the strange dirt trail that had once been on Mr. Harold's lawn. His house sat empty, its windows dark and lifeless, like a forgotten relic at the edge of the neighborhood. Occasionally, I'd glance toward it, half expecting to see Mr. Harold standing in the doorway again, staring blankly into the night. But he was gone, and for all intents and purposes, it seemed like everyone had moved on. Except for me. It was early February when things took a turn. I was out shoveling snow from the driveway when a man approached me. He was tall, lanky, with a scruffy beard and worn clothes. Something about him immediately put me on edge, though I couldn't quite place why. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice raspy from the cold. "You live around here?" "Yeah," I replied, gripping the shovel a little tighter. "Can I help you with something?" He glanced down the street toward Mr. Harold's house. "I'm looking for a man named Harold, lives at the end of the block. Haven't seen him around in a while." My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about my suspicions regarding Mr. Harold's disappearance, but this man clearly knew something. "He moved out a while ago," I said carefully. "Haven't seen him since." The man's expression darkened. "Moved out? Huh? That's funny, because he and I had some unfinished business." I didn't like where this conversation was going. What kind of business? The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "That's between me and Harold, but now that he's gone, I guess I'll have to find someone else to answer my questions." I didn't say anything. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the icy air suddenly felt suffocating. Something was very wrong here. Before I could respond, the man gave me a knowing look and turned to leave. As he walked away, I couldn't help but notice how his boots left deep impressions in the snow, as though he were carrying a heavy burden. I watched him disappear down the street, and for the first time since Mr. Harold had vanished, I felt genuine fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. The man's visit had shaken me in ways I hadn't expected. Who was he, and what kind of unfinished business did he have with Mr. Harold? More importantly, what had happened to Harold that had caused him to leave so abruptly, without a trace? The next morning, I decided to do some digging. I spent hours searching online, looking for any mention of a man named Harold who fit the description of my former neighbor. But no matter where I looked, there was nothing. It was as if he had never existed. No records, no social media, not even a trace of a former residence. Frustrated, I turned to the local records office, hoping to find something about the house he had lived in. Maybe there was some history there, something that could explain the strange behavior I'd witnessed. But what I found only deepened the mystery. The house at the end of the street had been vacant for over 10 years before Mr. Harold moved in. The previous owners had died in a tragic accident, and the property had sat untouched, slowly falling into disrepair. There was no record of a sale, no indication that anyone had even been interested in buying the place. Yet somehow, Harold had ended up there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking just beneath the surface, and I was determined to find out what it was. A few days later, I decided to go back to the house. Snow still covered the yard, and the windows were frosted over, but the door was unlocked. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, my breath fogging in the cold air. The inside was just as I remembered it, sparse, empty, and silent. But as I walked through the dimly lit rooms, something felt different. The first thing I noticed was the smell, damp, musty, with an underlying stench of rot. It was faint but unmistakable, like something decaying. My stomach churned as I made my way to the second floor, where Mr. Harold's room had been. The door was slightly ajar, and I nudged it open, my pulse quickening. The room was empty, but the bed was unmade, as if someone had left in a hurry. Papers were strewn across the floor, along with an old leather-bound journal. I knelt down and picked it up, my hands trembling. Flipping through the pages, I saw that the handwriting was messy, frantic. The entries were short, disjointed, but one thing was clear. Mr. Harold had been documenting something. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. The journal detailed his increasing paranoia, his belief that he was being watched, followed even. He wrote about hearing footsteps outside his window at night, about strange phone calls where no one would speak on the other end. But what scared me the most was the final entry. "They're here. I can hear them. I have to go." The words were scrawled so erratically that they were barely legible. There was no date, no indication of when it had been written, but it was clear that Mr. Harold had left in a panic. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I closed the journal. What had he been so afraid of? Who, or what, had been watching him? I was about to leave when something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, partially hidden by a pile of blankets, was a small metallic object. I walked over and picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a key. For what? I had no idea, but I knew I had to find out. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what the key belonged to. I tried every lock in the house, but nothing worked. It wasn't until I ventured into the basement that I finally found its purpose. The basement had always been unsettling, cold, dark, and damp. But now, as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. There, in the far corner of the room, was a small rusted door that I had never noticed before. My hands shook as I inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stone staircase that led even further down. My heart raced as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, I found a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with boxes and old, dusty jars. But what caught my attention was the large wooden crate in the center of the room. I hesitated before prying it open, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Inside was a tangle of blankets and something else, a small leather-bound book, similar to the journal I had found upstairs. I picked it up, flipping through the pages, but these were different. They weren't written by Mr. Harold. They were older, much older, much older. The entries were cryptic, but they told a story of the house's previous occupants, a couple who had lived there decades ago. They spoke of strange occurrences, of hearing voices at night, of seeing shadowy figures lurking in the woods. The last few pages were filled with frantic, terrified scribbles, and one sentence repeated over and over again. They took him. My stomach churned as I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. Who had they taken, and were they the same they that Mr. Harold had feared? I left the house that day, my heart pounding in my chest, and I haven't gone back since. I don't know what happened to Mr. Harold, and I'm not sure I want to, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever was haunting him is still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I can swear I hear footsteps outside my window.